Hello, ChurchOne. Last time I joined you was the beginning of this strange season, and now we're just starting to re-enter into activities that have been far away from us and out of reach. It is good to be with you, and it will be better soon. These certainly are sobering days and times, and as a church, it's important that we stay connected, both to God and to one another. How timely it is that we're looking at Psalms for the next several weeks. Ephesians 2:10 says that we are God's workmanship. That word workmanship actually means we are his poemas. We are the word poem. We are God's poem. Through singing, the original intent of the Psalms, through praying, and through pondering in the Psalms, we find ourselves in the greatest epic of all time, a poem where we are the object of love. One of the gifts of Psalms is that they engage the heart to get to the mind. Joy, laughter, tears, agony, despair, and hope. It's all there. They let us cry and yell and curse and question, as Mike talked about last week. Another word for a lot of these emotions that we find in the Psalms is lament. Over half of the Psalms are considered Psalms of lament. Lament, prayer as a question. Lament, opening ourselves open before God, no matter what we have to say, having the freedom to say it and ask it. Laments allow us to push hard at God in very personal terms, and in doing so, they push us toward our limits and expand our faith. The Psalms work to transform our imagination. They help us to imagine God bigger, larger, richer. They help us to imagine life in his time, in his space, and in his matter. As you ponder the Psalms, you're invited into a world where God and the reality of Christ's kingdom makes sense in a way that would not otherwise. The power of a good poem. When I was in high school, I memorized a Robert Herrick poem where the first line was, gather ye rosebuds while ye may. That poem woke me to the reality of less words to convey more and deep meaning. Psalms comfort and console. They challenge and they offer camaraderie. They offer that moment where one could say, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one. And they ultimately offer hope. There's a line in a psalm that says, when God hid his face. There was a time in my life, I had never read that psalm before. I was in my late 20s. You who've heard me speak before have heard me refer to a time of a Great Depression in my life where I couldn't get out of bed or off the couch. And when I read that, when God hid his face in Psalm 31, I was amazed that someone else had the exact feeling that I was feeling at that moment. And it was great comfort to me. The Psalms have the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. It's the covenant where God will, in the end, make good on all of his promises. Don't be so quick to think that they're all neat and tidy, though. Ellen Davis, an author and biblical scholar on the Old Testament, has this to say about some of the cursing Psalms where we cry out in anguish against God without answers. She says, do not clap your hands over the psalmist's mouth, like some do with Psalm 109, where anger and rage at injustice are present and no answers are offered. They give us words for our anger. They give us a camaraderie with our desire to see the vengeance of God where we see oppression. They can lead us to the mercy seat of Christ, to lay down our swords and to know that somebody will make wrongs right. Each one of us has a share in the prophetic task of naming and renouncing evil, including evil that is directed toward us. The Psalms give us permission. The cry for vengeance often turns into an act of an appeal for God to act. Psalms regularly trace a movement from complaint to confidence, from desperate petition to thanking God with over-the-top joy. Here's the thing. Psalms do this in the context of never telling us the end of the current situation or struggle or story. They don't make it all pretty, but they do tell us in the end all will be well. they bring. Because of that, there is great comfort for those who are suffering. God's gift to us, the Psalms are God's gift to us so that we can be shaped to be his gift to the world. They are God's gift to us so that we can be shaped to be his gift to the world. We're going to look at Psalm 116 today, and I'm just going to read a few of the first few verses. I'm going to do a small overview of Psalms 116, and then we're just going to hone in on just a little bit of the truth and the comfort and the challenge that we can find in Psalm 116. Psalm 116 starts out, please ignore the title, whatever your Bible might have given the title to Psalms 116 is, it's pretty likely it's inaccurate. So this is how it starts out. I love the Lord. I love the Lord because he's heard my voice and my supplications, because he's inclined his ear to me. Therefore I will call on him as long as I live. The snares of death encompassed me. The pangs of hell laid hold on me. I suffered distress and anguish, and I called on the name of the Lord. O Lord, save my life. Gracious is the Lord and righteous. Our God is merciful. The Lord protects the simple. When I was brought low, he saved me. And the psalm goes on. 21 times in the psalm, we find the personal pronoun I or me. Interestingly enough, 21 times we find the word God or Yahweh. It's a conversation. Our voice is spoken, our voice is heard, and God's voice is spoken and heard. In this Psalm 116, God is represented as listening, caring, powerful, and involved. In any piece of good literature, you have this preposition for and then to. You have this movement of cause and effect. Certainly we see this in this psalm. It's no different. In this psalm, you see what God is, how God is for us and what he's done, and then an individual's grateful response to what Yahweh's done. For example, God inclined his ear to me. I will call on him, cause and effect. We see that 10 times in Psalm 116. Conversation, cause and effect. We're going to just look at 3 of these declarative statements about God that can be discovered in this psalm. And we're looking to identify and understand in these 3 declarative statements a little bit more about who God is, where we find ourselves in this story, and what God might be saying. Because he inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call on him as long as I live. Inclines his ear. Some translations say bend his ear. I think about my dad later in life who suffered hearing loss, and he would constantly do this. Huh? What? He would bend his ear to hear what others were saying. As I was studying this, I began to think about May 25th, when George Floyd was murdered. And like you, I've been praying and asking and listening to hear what God is saying to me and what is my rightful response to that injustice. My children, like many of yours, are examples to Mike and I of active participation in fighting this current injustice. They're protesting and reading and having garage sales and donating funds to Black Lives Matter movements. But I, like many of you, am so stirred, I just find myself asking, what and where, Lord, am I to fight? God inclines his ear to me. So I want to listen. So as I was reading and pondering this song, a thought came to me to reach out to a friend of mine who's African American. I wanted to listen and gain an understanding and find out how she was doing. I wanted to ask her questions. I wanted her to help me understand and help me fight. I know her as my friend Raquel, but you might know her as the beautiful worshiper in the back row at ChurchOne, or you might know her as one of your kids' Sunday school teachers. We went back and forth in text. Interestingly enough, on the same day we were thinking about one another. So she was thrilled to get my text, and we were grateful to talk. One of the very first things she told me, and I want you to know I'm speaking her words with her permission, and ideally this would have been a living room conversation with all of you invited to come. But for now, this is where it is. And Raquel gratefully wanted to participate in the service this way. But she ultimately has a lot of hope. And one thing she said, and I'm going to quote her about the time that we're in, we have an opportunity to build some connections, to create some shared understanding that could help us all move the ball forward to where we all want to be. I love that. She talked about hope. Of just yesterday, there was a bill being introduced in the House around policing, and it might be movement towards something positive. She talked about her optimism and also what she doesn't agree with in the current fight and in the current protest. She talked about the tears that welled up in her when she saw the police meeting up with protesters, reading out the names of victims She talked about being in community. She talked about this just shouldn't be. We shared our solidarity in raising sons and wanting to raise sons who respect women well, who fight injustices, who know what to say and what not to say in our home. But then the road diverged, and she shared as a Black mother her fear for her child's life that I've never had to identify with. How she constantly, and she said every day, thinks about it. Every choice she makes is one out of protection and provision for him. How when she looks at schools and neighborhoods, how she has to raise him to respond to situations different than my sons have to respond. Raquel fought for Black youth long before she was a mom herself. She saw the face of injustice in youth when she was at Princeton, and she mentored a young man. When she graduated from Princeton Law School and was working in Washington, D.C., she got a call that her mentee, the young male she mentored, was kicked out of school because he was in a fight with another child, but that child was white. But the Black son, her mentee, was kicked out of school. So she talked about fighting and calling the school and threatening a civil lawsuit. And by 3 p.m. in one day, in a 24-hour period, got that young man reinstated in school. And she went on to tell the great things he has done. And we together pondered what a difference a phone call can make. She talked about being exhausted and to be prepared for a marathon and not a sprint. She shared her own mistakes about the times in her life where she distorted human dignity and worth and needed grace. She constantly gave me grace for the questions I ask and continues to do that in future conversations. She shared about attending a ChurchOne women's Bible study where she was not certain about whether or not she should attend. And she shared about a recent email exchange with another attendee at that Bible study who very recently in the last couple weeks became aware of offensive words to Raquel and emailed her and asked her forgiveness. She said to me, "Can you believe it? This is the kind of thing that makes such a difference." She shared humility and grace and hope. We laughed and cried, and most of all, we looked to Christ for what does love look like and what's the way forward. And we ended our conversation with hope and prayer. God bends his ear toward us, and we can bend our ear toward one another. Further down in the psalm, there's a gem of a verse that talks about the justice of God, and it's easy to miss. It says this in Psalm 116, verse 16, "You have loosed my bonds. I will offer you a thanksgiving sacrifice." Loosed, to break forth, to free, to freely open, to set free. To set free so it can take off. You've done that to my bonds, to my chains, to my fetters, to my shackles. You have set free my imprisonment. Therefore, I will sacrifice. This is what God did. He set me free. And then what do? I put myself under. I sacrifice. I subject myself to the one true God. It's ironic. Unless you know the object of our identification is absolute love and true justice. He brings the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. We're locked up inside of ourselves without Christ. We're locked up in ourselves. We're racist, we're hateful, we're ego-filled, and we strive for our one precious life. I know for me, before knowing God, it felt like a prison, and God set me free. And my response is to say, I'm yours. What else would I want, and where else would I go? You've loosed my bonds. I will offer you a thanksgiving sacrifice. Another one of these gems and declarative moments, and the last one we're going to talk about, is Psalm 116, verse 15. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful ones. I thought it was so strange, that verse, when I read it. I couldn't understand it. Why would death be precious? Until I studied the word precious. It means costly. Read it with that. Costly is the death of his faithful ones. He takes our life and our death seriously. There is a cost to the life we have. Prophetic words written long before the time of Christ, pointing to a future day where the ultimate cost would be a death, and that death would pay for a life to be lived. Read the Psalms, all of them, with the end in mind. Read for the hope that in the end, all things will be made right. Read the Psalms with the truth of the gospel laid over them. That what started on Calvary lives and abides in his church. Look at us. I wish we were sitting together and could look around, but certainly imagine that in your minds. We are the beloved community that Martin Luther King talked so much about. It starts with one another. We have the opportunity to be the beloved community to a watching world. Let's get this one right. Let's listen and let's pray. Father, I thank you for Psalm 116. I thank you that in that psalm I sensed you bending your ear toward me and calling me to do that with another. I thank you that when I don't have answers and I only have questions, that I can sit and listen. And as the rabbis would say, I can turn it and turn it and turn it with your word. So Father, I pray that the words from today would just spark us as a community to be better listeners and in the end to love one another in beloved community. I hope you have a great Sunday, ChurchOne.